So now I have the pleasure of introducing Joanna Dafoe, who's the National Director of Climate Change at the Insurance Bureau of Canada, who will lead us through the very first panel, the Task Force for Resilient Recovery. So let me just set that up and we'll pass this over to Joanna.
Great. Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay. So thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everyone for joining us. And welcome to our panel discussion on the work of the Task Force for a Resilient Recovery. So this morning, within a very brief period of time, 45 minutes, our goal is to learn about these bold moves and ideas which can inform Canada's economic recovery. And so we'll hear from three members from our task force, as well as a distinguished expert from the World Resources Institute, on the theme of the role that climate resilience must play in Canada's economic recovery in order to, we all hear in the media all the time, to build back better and to sort of bring meaning to what this actually entails. And I'll just start by contemplating on the fact that, it's pretty remarkable as practitioners in the field of catastrophes and climate risk that we're actually grounding our discussion in the midst of a global pandemic. And so all of these design principles and insights from our discussion today have such an immediate application to our current crisis. So to jump to our panel, I'll briefly introduce our panelists by order of discussion. If you have a question to pose during the panel, please type them in the chat box. We'll have a limited and a few select opportunities to field audience questions, so I will monitor the Q&A box. So first of all, we're joined by Richard Florizone, who is our chair of the task force, and he is the president and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And next, we're joined by Leonardo Martinez-Diaz, who is the global director of the Sustainable Finance Center at the World Resources Institute. Third, we will hear from Dawn Forgeron, who is the president and CEO of the Insurance Bureau of Canada, whose work on the task force focused on climate change adaptation. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Andy Chisholm, a member of the board of directors of RBC, Sustainable Finance Expert Panel member, and a leader whose work is focused on creating the enabling conditions for sustainable finance in Canada. So Richard, over to you. Can you give us an overview of the work of the task force? What are these 5 bold moves? Who participated in this group, and how exactly did you arrive at these recommendations?
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, let me just set the table. So I'm going to bring up, I only have a handful of slides, but just to kind of set the table for the conversation. So as Joanna said, we're here to talk about, let me put that in presentation mode, the Task Force for a Resilient Recovery. So the task force itself was, or is, our work is now done, but we're an independent group, bipartisan group that came together in March. Quite a diverse group. We tried to be bipartisan. We've got folks with a liberal, NDP, and conservative background. We've got members of think tanks, corporations, governments, academe, foundations. As Laura talked about Cat IQ, it made me think it's kind of a similar kind of collaboration across sectors. And we all came together initially and rather spontaneously with the same idea that all of us had been talking to government and corporate partners about in the midst of this pandemic, how can we not just respond, but think about building back better? And so the group came together with the support of a number of foundations to do some work to ask those very questions. And the way we went about it, our work was really structured around this goal. So we said we wanted Canada to have a resilient recovery, which meant for us, and of course, resilience can mean a lot of things, but for us, it meant how do you support the jobs, the infrastructure, and growth that will keep Canada competitive in the clean economy of the 21st century? So again, resilient recovery has to include a lot of things, particularly the health and social safety net, dealing with the impacts of those directly impacted or affected by the pandemic. But we were looking at the longer term and really kind of focused on three criteria: the economy, environment, and equity. We wanted to talk about what government could do over the next 5 years. We wanted to talk about what was happening globally. We wanted to get the best ideas from across Canada that would lead to a net zero, climate resilient future, but would kind of optimize these three factors, kind of rejecting the compromise between the economy and environment and trying to look for inclusive measures. So that's sort of the context. The background to all of this is what's happening around the world. So of course, everyone is responding to the first and second waves of the pandemic. But underneath that, or alongside of it, you're seeing some very significant investments in what you might call green stimulus. And I've listed a few of them here. Most prominent is maybe the EU budget in July, which targeted over $1 trillion for climate-related initiatives in a whole range of areas, which I'll get to in a moment. Germany, France, the United Kingdom. Some of you might be surprised that the UK, even with a conservative prime minister, has moved forward their future ban on sales of fossil fuel and of powered vehicles to electric vehicles. So they had a ban for 2040 that they've moved forward to 2035, and they may be moving it forward to 2030. And of course, a backdrop to all of this is the Biden plan, which I guess, no one wants to call the US election. That's hazardous. But if the Democrats do win, we've got well over a $2 trillion US plan that would see very significant investment in the types of things I'm going to talk about shortly. So where is all that investment going? First off, just one last thought on the numbers is that to give you a sense of the scale, to put these in a Canadian context, on a per capita basis, if you look at the EU, investments plus the investments in Germany and France, it represents, around $2,000, a little over $2,000 to $3,000 a person. The Biden plan, you see how big that really is. That would be over 8,000 per capita, a very significant investment. And the Canada one is our recommendation. So just before, I just have two more slides. Let's talk about where that money's going and what our recommendations are. So if you look internationally, as I said, our work, we tried to gather the best ideas from around the world and across Canada. And when we did that, it was really kind of 4 or 5 buckets that emerged as best practice. And this was also grounded in the research. What we're seeing and what we think makes sense for Canada are investments in energy efficient and climate resilient buildings. We think that's good for the economy. It's good for the environment. It'll save money in the long run, and it's also quite a strong stimulus in getting people back to work. In transportation, we were struck by the transition to ZEVs around the world, and that Canada risks falling behind if we don't get our supply chains ready and consumers ready to adopt zero emission vehicles. In clean energy, there's a whole range of work happening here. You've heard talk probably about hydrogen. The fact is that 18 countries now, representing 75% of global GDP, have a hydrogen strategy. The question is, what should Canada's role be in the hydrogen game? And there's other policy recommendations inside clean energy that are happening in Canada. We've talked about the need to support greater electrification with specific investments in transmission and distribution. And finally, these investments in nature, as countries recognize that investing in nature not only makes for a more resilient future, but actually has a good economic return, and again has a positive stimulus. If I could leave you with one thought from this slide, it's just that we felt strongly, and we were very encouraged that our kind of bottom-up analysis from Canada, the kind of ideas we saw across Canada, aligned very well with what we were seeing internationally and what some of the best academic research was saying. So that left column, International Experts, is a paper out of Oxford by Nobel economist Joe Stiglitz and his colleagues, who specifically identify buildings, clean energy investments in nature as some of the best ideas that could foster a recovery that was positive for the economy and environment. So in summary, what we ended up with were 5 bold moves. We've got 22 specific policies underneath these. We've got specific partners in the report. report. But you see the investments in the 5 areas I've talked about and actually over half the proposed investment is in those energy efficient buildings for efficiency and climate resilience. The ZEVs, the clean energy sector's investments in nature, and the 5th one is a cross-cutting bucket that talks about fostering clean technology across the Canadian economy. So that's the landscape just to get us started and to kick off the panel discussion. Thank you, Joanna.
Terrific, thank you, Richard. So I don't see any questions that have come in yet. So I will pose a question to you, Richard, about just the reception that you've received to date with the work of the task force. You know, what have you heard from government? How are the recommendations reflected in the speech from the throne, you know, if at all? So welcome your thoughts on how it's been received in Ottawa.
I guess our sense is the speech from the throne got it about right in that, you know, its first priorities, as we always said in our own report, were to do the immediate response, to fight the virus, the vaccine, to deal with the immediate economic fallout. But there was a third pillar in the speech from the throne that really encompassed almost everything we've talked about here. Now, of course, that's just a speech at this point, and numbers aren't behind it. Since then, we've seen moves by the Canada Infrastructure Bank, I think about $10 billion towards building retrofits, which is very positive. We've seen that investment by the Government of Canada and Ontario in an electric vehicle plant in Ontario, which again, you know, the devil's in the details on that investment, but from a broad strategic perspective, it's very well aligned with the task force. So I'd say it's encouraging at this point. I think, you know, now it comes down to budgets and decisions, not just for governments, but also for the private sector on how we're going to take up this charge and build a more resilient and prosperous Canada. Great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. So now on this notion of, you know, how governments are responding to recommendations, there's sort of think tanks all over producing insights and recommendations, and it's, you know, important work to see how governments are responding to the enthusiasm and the momentum and the contributions from non-government actors. And so it's also timely that we're currently in the global year of action on adaptation, with sort of unprecedented global interest and momentum in this notion of climate resilience. And so with Leo here, with the World Resources Institute, we're wondering if you could give us some of that global perspective of the work underway on climate resilience and adaptation, and critically, how this momentum is linking with recovery efforts from jurisdictions around the world.
Thanks so much, Joanna, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I think the task force was absolutely right in focusing not just on mitigation that is cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but also on making our communities more resilient and to help them prepare for some of the impacts of climate change, which are likely to happen almost regardless of the ultimate path of emissions reductions that we take. And so some of that, I think, has to be factored in, and we have to start dealing with it. As you know, Canada itself is experiencing a degree of warming about twice the rate of the global average. And so this makes resilience a really important priority for Canada. Of course, there is no better resilience policy than mitigation and cutting emissions. But at the same time, we have to put in place the systems and the investments that are going to make sure that our infrastructure, our communities are better prepared. One of the key events, I think, over the last 3 years has been a much greater appreciation of the economic net benefits of resilience investing. As you may know, a group called the Global Commission on Adaptation came together last year. It was co-chaired by Bill Gates, the now IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, and former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And this group essentially tried to convey that resilience investments or investments in resilience have a very high benefit cost ratio. They identified a series of investments in various sectors, saying, look, for every dollar you invest in these types of activities, you're going to get $5 to $9 back. And of course, many folks in your audience understand that quite well, working in the finance sector and especially in insurance. So the economic benefits, the economic arguments for resilience are no-brainers. So then the question for us is, why don't we see much more of this happening if the economic argument is so compelling? And I think there's three reasons which I think are now beginning to shift in a positive direction. The first is awareness of solutions. We might have the numbers in the back of our mind about the cost-benefit ratios and so on, but it remains an abstraction only until you make it real for people on the ground, people in businesses, people in governments at all levels. Does it really become much more practical? You have to, I think, make people aware of the actual investments that are going on, of actual projects, actual investments that can actually make your community or your business better. And those have to have not just payoffs and benefits in the distant future, but also they have to pay off today. There have to be some tangible benefits that people can point to in the present. And so for that reason, the former resilience advisor to President Obama, a colleague of mine, and I wrote a book just last year called Building a Resilient Tomorrow that sets out to identify many, many such examples in the United States of mayors, of bankers, of military leaders, of business people trying to put together specific investments in resilience and adaptation in their own communities and try to make a much more lively story of how resilience can actually be put into place. And I think we need a lot more of this. We need a lot more examples of how this can be done. And we need to showcase what I would say is a quiet revolution happening in many parts of the economy where different leaders are starting to put these investments in place. So we need much more awareness of those solutions and many more examples of how it can be done. The second thing that is beginning to shift is the role of the private sector. I think before the sense was that climate change was a distant threat. Now it's become pretty clear that it's here. Just in the U.S. alone, I think the last, the years around 2017 were a tipping point. You see that in public opinion, the number of people telling pollsters that climate change was having an impact on the U.S., quote unquote, right now, shifted 16 points between March 2015 and 2018. It's not surprising why. Major floods in the Midwest affecting some 14 million people. The first set of record-breaking wildfires in California. For the first time, 3 Category 4 hurricanes hitting the mainland in a single year. 2017, 2018, that period was truly a tipping point in people's minds. And as a result, you got, I think, the private sector after that really moving to say, look, we need to get a handle on this problem. And within the private sector, I think the financial sector has been most active because they see the impacts on asset prices right away. They can see what's coming because they have to plan long-term for pensions, for endowments, for asset owners who have to have their returns secure over longer periods. And so as a result, you saw, for example, just 2 months ago, a group convened under a US regulator called the CFTC, putting out a report about how to manage climate risk in the US financial system. And their conclusion was not surprising, but it was, I think, unanimous. And that is that climate change is a systemic risk, presents a systemic risk to the US financial system, and it has to be managed much more effectively. And that group convened sort of like the task force in Canada, private sector, NGOs, think tanks, included some of the biggest banks in the US, major energy companies, and so on. And the report was approved by a vote of 34-0. You don't get many votes like that in Washington these days. And so it just shows you how strong the conviction is in the private sector that this has to be taken on. And finally, I think this is the key point that the task force made. We're in the middle, obviously, of a pandemic and a serious recession. And therefore, resilience can offer a way to help stimulate economic activity and help us exit this period of economic recession while building back better, as is the cliche now. But really what that means is, can we use this moment to put in place the long-term investments we need to economic activity, which is going to be crucial long-term. And here I think what's needed is a couple of things. One is we need much better tools to help people who are deploying capital to figure out what are the best decisions to be made in resilience. If you have a marginal dollar for resilience, investments in resilience, where do you put it? Do you put it in the proverbial seawall? Do you try to encourage communities to change land use? Do you put it in better data systems, right? That type of a prioritization decision is not easy. And so we need better tools to help those decision makers deploy that capital more effectively. And finally, we need much better tools to incorporate climate change into investment decisions. One of the key features of the Year of Action that you mentioned on adaptation is something called the CCRI. That's the climate change, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. This is a group that is trying to bake climate into decisions about investing in infrastructure. How do you make sure that the infrastructure investments you're making are going to be climate resilient? And that is, of course, a complex matter that involves a lot of the kinds of models that your listeners spend a lot of their time on. But it's crucial that, that those tools be user-friendly, very widely available, and hopefully open source, so that more and more people can incorporate them into their own thinking. So there's just some of the key highlights from the international side.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Leo. You know, I think everyone here has this high-level appreciation of the notion of how adaptation can protect us against future economic losses, but there's no better time now than to really think through how that can be applied in the context of an economic recovery. So your case examples are very helpful in that regard. Now we have two questions, or two questions. The first is just a clarifying question from Michael Young on the name of the commission that issued that report on financial risk. So Michael, it's the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission that issued the report. It's very long, but very terrific. And then Deepika also posed a great question on the potential hazard of engaging political risk. Richard responded in the chat thread, and other task force members feel free to engage as well. But I think Leo partially responded to that question when he referenced the sort of bipartisan appeal of resilient initiatives in the United States, which of all jurisdictions really kind of struggles with the partisan nature of responding to climate change. In the nature of time, maybe Richard and Leo will bracket that question if you want to go into it in a bit more detail. But I think for now, we have a pretty compressed window. So I'm going to invite Dawn, who, you know, if there's any industry that is laser sharp focused on finding opportunities to reduce physical climate risk from climate change, it's the property and casualty insurance industry perspective. And you really brought that vantage to your work on the task force. So Don, I'm wondering if you could share with us, and it really sort of builds on Leo's remarks, what insights the P&C industry brings to bear in advancing solutions for a resilient economic recovery.
I don't want to be the first one to say, Don, you're on mute, so I have to make sure I unmute here. Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Joanna. Thank you for the question. First of all, it's this is my first industry-wide conference since March. I can't see everybody, but I was looking at the participant list, and there are a lot of good friends and colleagues on that list. So welcome to all of you. And I do want to acknowledge the leadership that Richard provided on the task force. It really was an honor on behalf of the industry to represent on this task force. A lot of great thinkers, great minds. Richard managed to pull all of this together in a masterful way. So congratulations to Richard for that. The insurance perspective, I think, Joanna, is obviously an important one. We certainly know a thing or two about recovering from catastrophes. That's our business. We bring this sort of risk-based logic to conversations. We model managing complex and long-term risks. So a lot of things that are very much relatable to the current climate that we're in, and managing a way forward, and managing in a way that not just hopefully brings us back, but to the extent possible, avoiding future cat events such as this. Everyone's familiar with the cost of climate change, whether it's the financial cost or the human cost. And we as insurers and some of our insurer members have been on the vanguard of talking about climate change for many, many years now. Some of the first discussions were raised by insurers, especially European-based insurers. And we see ourselves very much as partners, along with others in the financial sector, partners with government, those in academia. And we think about this in terms of a whole of society approach. And I think for too long, there was a lot of finger pointing going on that said, government needs to do more, the private sector needs to step up. And we see it as a whole of society approach that's critical to finding our way through this, whether it's in response to building back better or climate change writ large. Longer term, there's a need for P&C products for society to function. Someone coined a phrase years ago that said that P&C products were the oxygen of the economy, that if we all look out the window and life as we see it would almost cease to exist if it weren't for the risk transfer mechanisms that insurance provides. And sadly, some of these risk transfer mechanisms that we have now in place, for some of these risks, they've already become uninsurable. And certainly we're not on a sustainable path with respect to that. The financial cost, I think, again, is known to many. I think Laura put up a slide earlier. We were averaging about $400 million a year in cat losses, insured cat losses from 83 to 08. The last decade, that's jumped up to almost $2 billion. And in 2020, 2 events alone in Alberta resulted in $2 billion in insured losses and many more in uninsured losses. And I think Laura's slide showed we were in excess of $2 billion with a number of other cat events across the country. So it continues. We only need to look south of the border to see the devastation that's taking place on the West Coast. We've had a very active hurricane season again. So these events will continue. The industry has long said that this is a two-pronged fight, that clearly we need to do something about emission reduction, absolutely critical in terms of the long-term fight against climate change. But as Len said, there's the stuff that's staring us in the face in the need to adapt to the environment as we see it today. And I do think in terms of the polling numbers and how more consumers are coming on board, I think adaptation can lead people to understand the risks of climate change far more than talking about emission reduction. And so that adaptation piece was clearly something, Joanna, that we wanted to bring to the task force. We thought we had a unique perspective. I often reminded the members of the task force that we had a very narrow window and a very narrow lane that we wanted to stay in, but we felt it was an important lane. And when you looked at the recommendations that Richard just put up on the screen, we have under 2 of those, under buildings and under nature, we have recommendations there that are very, very germane to our industry and to our members. So I'll pause there. I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Don. So if folks in the audience, have questions about the nature of the adaptation resiliency recommendations, we can always circle back on that. And we have 2 great questions that I'm going to recommend we actually hold until after Andy's remarks, just because it would be great to have Andy also respond to some of these great perspectives that we're hearing from the audience. So Andy, we heard from Don one of the private sector perspectives on Canada's economic recovery and the role that insurance plays in helping to manage and transfer risk and avoid future loss. And you're coming at this question from a really broad and ambitious agenda of encouraging sustainable finance in Canada. So, my question for you is twofold. The first is, in your view, how is Canada's economic recovery important for enabling or determining our ability to achieve our climate change objectives? That's the first part. And the second part is curious to hear from you how the outcomes of the task force play a role in encouraging capital flows and risk management activities which facilitate sustainable economic growth. And if you have any examples, that would be great as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. So, not to be nitpicky, I guess, but your question as phrased, which is how's the economic recovery important for low carbon transition and advancing, et cetera, versus how important is the low carbon transition and advancing these opportunities to manage risk to the recovery. And so that semantic kind of difference, it becomes a kind of loaded question, and it's a really good loaded question in the sense of there's a lot of voices which say in a period of COVID, how on earth do you get people to focus on these things? How on earth do you find the money to do these things? Isn't this a more slow burn kind of thing when we have an acute, immediate health and financial emergency to deal with? And that debate is really important. My answer, my perspective on this won't surprise you, in the least. As Richard said, we have to focus on COVID and the recovery and dislocation coming out of that as an immediate and intense high priority. We have to get stabilization. But beyond that stabilization, we're likely to find ourselves in a slow, grinding kind of economic circumstance. And in that context, we're going to need stimulus. We're going to need to be smart, and we're going to need to build back, not to the status quo ante when the world's moving beyond, but to be very thoughtful about where we go. So let's focus on mitigating the next problems coming at us. And the most visible of this is climate change. And we need to be realistic, not only about that physical impact and all that, but also the global desire to shun carbon emissions and what this may mean for our carbon intense economy. And so building low carbon competitiveness and resilience to the inevitable climate change effects are really critical. So I think we're saying, let's try to adjust faster and better than the next country. Let's try to do it in a way that's realistic for Canada. Let's put people to work innovating in buildings, in energy, in transportation, in infrastructure, electrification with regard to our natural capital, and build resilience and gain a bigger piece of the global economic pie while being part of the climate change solution. And if we move fast, we can cement that low carbon competitiveness. Now, the sad part is climate change is not getting COVID. It's not going to wait. The clock is ticking past midnight. And if we listen to the science, it's going to be worse than COVID financially, socially, politically, health terms. And the cost of the physical risk, which Don and others have enumerated, are already with us and rapidly escalating. The risks of transition to our economy are about to hit. So is economic recovery essential to get on with this? Should we consider it a cost that we can't afford? Or is this something where this is an essential investment with a payback that spurs new activity? Is it better when we've only fully recovered some years from now? Or in the near term, when we're looking for new things to move the economy and when we're still in time to mitigate the risk and seize the opportunity that's available? Beyond the employment potential, which we tried to highlight in the report. The happy part is we're finding that these decarbonization solutions are experiencing massive cost curve reductions, and that the efficiencies are surprising us positively, which impacts productivity and competitiveness. And industry by industry, we're finding efficiencies and capabilities that we never imagined, just like technology is done more broadly. And at the same time, eliminating emissions, improving resilience. So avoiding cost and loss, enhancing value, this seems like a pretty straightforward decision, even though it feels horrendously difficult and complicated. Goldman Sachs has just estimated that the result of these things, the cost curve reduction, new technologies, and what it facilitates, and a lower cost of capital, has just shaved $1 trillion off the cost to achieve net zero from their 2019 estimate to today. In 1 year, just that delta, that shift of improvements in capabilities, effectiveness, and reduction of cost has led to reducing the ultimate size of this investment by $1 trillion. Now, that last part, I'd like to amplify. The capital markets are already racing in this direction. ESG is moving at lightning speed in investing markets. Banks are talking of demanding plans for net zero 2050 in their lending considerations, and insurers are extremely focused on these things. So as a result, the cost of capital is rapidly rising for industries and activities that don't fit Paris alignment, and they're lowering for many clean tech decarbonization solutions. So recovery or not, this is going to build efficiencies, enhance competitiveness, and capture the opportunities that are there, and mitigate the costs we can't afford. And we can either harness the forces of capital markets, or we can fight the forces of capital markets. So perhaps when we're in this difficult time, this is the time to break the mold, when the psychology will be, let's find something new and avoid the next disaster. So at the same time, I guess your second question, how does all this kind of encourage capital flows, et cetera? And again, it won't surprise you. I think that this report fits very neatly beside and in alignment with the expert panel on sustainable finance and that work, where we stressed that as much as there will be a price for the public purse associated with these solutions, they can and they must be accompanied by frameworks and structures to crowd in, maximize the crowding in of capital from private sources. And these blended finance techniques are very conducive to clean tech, electrification, energy transformation, retrofit, all these things that we talk about. And finally, I guess retrofit's a great sort of micro example. Let's reflect on why it doesn't occur. Part of the market failure is that private markets aren't convinced about the economic profile of financing these energy savings and the cost mitigation from floods, et cetera, in part because they don't know, they don't have the experience, they don't have the data. So if we're smart and we pursue our retrofit recommendation in a manner that collects the data, measures the cash flow patterns, assesses the efficiencies, benefits from the cost curve, soon this becomes financeable in a cost-effective manner with no government support. And if we focus on the resilience measures, flood, wind, heat, alongside energy and water efficiencies, all of a sudden the risks decline and the regulators take note, and green mortgages or predictable cash flow based retrofit finance is all of a sudden deemed less risky and afforded lower regulatory costs and seen as desirable assets for insurers and other institutions to invest in. So I'll stop it there.
Terrific, thanks Andy. So, you know, with 3 minutes left and some terrific questions that we've heard from the audience, you know, we heard a question from Deepika on political risk if the task force is exposing itself to potential partisan nature. Cheyenne asked a question about the role of equity in the work of the task force. And there was also a question on resilient infrastructure, if we have enough skilled workers to undertake this work. So I'll just sort of open all three of those, and first taker, pick your question. So I'll open it up to the panel if any of those questions you want to respond to.
I'm happy to tackle them all at once, Joanna. I took the
Yes,
liberty of chatting some answers in the chat if people want to look. But look, first off, just very quickly, absolutely bipartisanship. The risk of political risk, absolutely, and that's why the private sector engagement is so important, and the trends that Andy has talked about, for example, are so encouraging. If you want to get a sense of what's happening, I'd recommend Google Walmart Sustainability Summit, which was in Climate Week in New York just in the lead up to the UN General Assembly, and the CEO of Walmart basically said, look, we can't rely on government to do this. Now that's in the US context. So it's quite remarkable what companies are doing, the kind of private sector engagement that's happening. The Walmart's committed to net zero within Paris targets without offsets, quite an ambitious goal. On equity, as I said in the chat, absolutely, we tried to keep it front and center, and we found some really exciting ideas that we profiled, particularly around Indigenous energy proposals. There's been some incredible Indigenous-led clean energy projects in Canada that we should build on. In training, specifically targeting women and youth, because this has been a she-cession in a way that the data are quite remarkable. The 08-09 recession hit men more. This one has hit women in a far greater way. Having said that, we haven't done enough on equity inclusion, and it has to be front and center in any program design and implementation. And finally, training. We couldn't agree more. And actually, when you look at our recommendations, training is a big theme under all of them. And in fact, there's now a follow-up initiative called Colleges for Resilient Recovery that I've been a bit involved with to grab that mantle and to start the training programs that will feed this. And I'll put one last plug in, which is to say training. Actually, I mentioned that Nobel laureate's paper on pandemic recovery. Training was actually identified as one of the 5 top initiatives that are good for the economy and environment, most high profile or best impact. So training in of itself is also a positive government investment in the short term. So thanks for the questions.
If I can just jump in quickly on the skills issue. So in our book, Alice Hill and I looked at what architecture licensing organizations are requiring of their graduates in terms of climate change. And we found that they're not. Climate change is not seen as a core requirement because they say the market's not yet demanding it. So if the market doesn't demand it, we can't require it. And then you have a chicken and egg problem where these skills never get incorporated into the mandatory curriculum. We need to break that cycle. We need to make sure that we are teaching the intersection of climate and engineering, climate and architecture, climate and urban design systematically, and that we're licensing professionals accordingly. And so that is, I think, going to require some leadership on the part of the industry, but it's absolutely necessary because we don't yet have that kind of skill set yet in sufficient scale.
Great. So we could easily ask Don, Leo, Richard, Andy, like 30 minutes of follow-up questions. This could easily occupy a full day conversation, and we really just talked through the tip of the iceberg. But unfortunately, we're out of time. As I'm sure you'd all agree, we are left with very enriching and thoughtful observations. And as I'm sure you all are as well, I'm struck by this theme, how climate resilience should feature in our economic recovery, realizing that the limited window of opportunity is closing. And so there is this timeliness that really underscores the importance of the conversation. And I'm certain with everyone here today, with our collective resolve and know-how and capabilities, that we can seize this challenge of our generation and really bring meaning to the catchphrase that we keep on hearing, that we need to build back better.